Raise your cast if you've ever broken a bone. Likely, you had some kind of trauma that caused it, like falling off the monkey bars, a car wreck, or, as in the case with my friend, falling off a pair of high-heeled shoes in Payless. But that's her story to tell. Osteoporosis is a condition where bone mass decreases. What's the big deal if you have osteoporosis? Well, if you fall, you just might break. You're listening to Healthy Looks Great on You, a lifestyle medicine podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Vicki Petz Casper. For 2 decades, I practiced as a board-certified obstetrician-gynecologist, navigating the complex world of women's health. But life took an unexpected turn when my own health failed. Emerging on the other side, I discovered the transformative power of lifestyle medicine. Now, I'm on a mission to share its incredible benefits with you. So buckle up, because we are going on a journey to our very own mini medical school, where you will learn how lifestyle medicine can help prevent, treat, and sometimes even reverse disease. Osteoporosis is a thinning of the bones at a microarchitectural level, resulting in a tendency for the skeleton to break. Now, people with severe osteoporosis can actually get a fracture without falling or with very minor trauma. You know, the straw that breaks the camel's back can literally be a straw. Throughout the world, it's reported that in the year 2000, there were 9 million fractures due to brittle bones. So this is a global issue. And divided into nearly equal thirds, they involved the forearm, the vertebral column, and the hip. Now, if you break your arm, you're going to get a cast, and all your friends can sign it with a Sharpie pen, and in about 4 to 6 weeks, you'll be on your merry way. But what if someone steps on a crack and breaks your back? Or you make a slip and fracture your hip? Well, many people with those types of fractures end up very limited in their ability to walk or even care for themselves. It can lead to depression, chronic pain, and placement in a nursing home. And there's an increased risk of dying of 10 to 20%. So osteoporosis is a big deal. What are the risk factors for osteoporosis? Well, advancing age, history of a fracture, falling and you can't get up, steroid use, a family history of osteoporosis, and specifically a family history of a hip fracture. So the goal is to have strong bones throughout your life so that you can live long, healthy, and happy. We're going to talk about how to do that, but first, you need to go to mini medical school. Bone strength is determined by density to some degree. It's also determined by the size and shape of the bone. Today, right off the bat, I have a pop quiz for you. Do you know what bone in the body is most frequently broken? It's the clavicle or collarbone. And here's why. It's little bitty. It's shaped like an S, and this bone is long and thin. And so if you crash your bicycle or dive to keep the soccer ball out of the goal, crack. Okay, I know most of you listening to this podcast are probably beyond that. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the thigh bone or femur, and it usually doesn't break unless you jump from 40 feet or something because it's stronger, it's bigger, it's larger, it's thick. The bottom line is that some bones are more likely to break than others. There are several other factors that contribute to bone strength besides size, such as what I mentioned earlier was microarchitecture. Think of this like scaffolding holding up a building. Crosslinks form a network of connections that lead to strength, and when those break down, the building might collapse. Bones are made up of minerals, so the degree of mineralization matters too. Another contributing factor is bone turnover. Did you even know that bones turn over? I'm not talking about rolling over. I'm talking about that bones are not the dried up white things scattered in the desert after the vultures have picked a carcass. Instead, they're living. And bone turnover is always happening, kind of like road work on the interstate. Old bone is broken down and new bone replaces it. Well, hopefully it's more efficient than filling potholes, but it is a never-ending process that keeps bones healthy and strong, as well as maintaining calcium levels where they're supposed to be. You've probably heard of bone mineral density because that's the test we use to measure your risk of a fracture. And it's designed for use in at-risk people, like women who are postmenopausal. So when we look at your risk for fracture, it's not just the bone mineral density. Your other contributing risk factors are a major part of the picture too. The best combination for predicting future fracture is your age, plus a prior fracture history, plus your bone mineral density test. Then the results are divided into low, moderate, high, and very high. So now you've had a bone mineral density and your doctor told you that your T-score is this or that. Let's stop right there. What is a T-score? We didn't really learn that in medical school, but statistics was a prerequisite for getting accepted to medical school. But you know I hate math, so let's move on to what a T-score means when you get your bone mineral density result from a DEXA scan. A normal T-score is 1 or higher, and it's just downhill after that. If your T-score is between -1 and -2.5, that's called osteopenia. So that's your vocab word for the day. Osteo means bone, penia means thin, so thin bones. If your T-score is less than or equal to -2.5, then technically you qualify as having osteoporosis. Now, let's look at how they come up with these numbers. They did studies that showed that people with T-scores of less than -2.5 are at increased risk for fracture. But here's a tricky tidbit. More people with osteopenia actually break a bone than people with osteoporosis. Wait, what? And that, my friends, is why you need to understand statistics. What I quoted was an absolute number. And the reason is that a lot more people have osteopenia, so it's a big old group of people compared with those with straight out osteoporosis. But here's why it matters. You cannot make decisions solely based on your bone mineral density test. Because if you're prone to fall all the time and you have osteopenia, then you're clearly more likely to break something than someone who has osteoporosis but has strong muscles and never falls. You see, 2 things hold us upright: our bones and our muscles. So if your bones are weak, it's super important that your muscles be strong. Someone wise said, when I was young, I exercised to benefit the outside, and now I exercise to benefit the inside. Now, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. First of all, I said you could break without falling, but that's really only if you have super brittle bones. Then I said people who have osteopenia have more fractures than people with osteoporosis because there are more people with osteopenia. So falling really does matter. It's an important risk factor. So let's look a little more in depth at that. Alcohol contributes to both bone loss and increases the likelihood that you will fall. So that's a risk factor. And here's where being skinny may be bad for your health, because if you've got a little extra padding on your hips, you're less likely to break them if you fall. But if you're strong, you're less likely to fall. Poor health in general is a risk factor. We call that frailty. People who have trouble getting around and have to use a cane or a walker are more likely to fall, and they're more likely to break. And dementia factors into this as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about bone mineral density testing, as well as calcium and vitamin D supplementation and the medications used to treat osteoporosis. But while we're talking about health in general, there are several diseases that up your risk for fracture. They are things like rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, hyperthyroidism, both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and kidney disease. There are some drugs that can cause osteoporosis as well. These are commonly used to treat breast cancer, and in fact, a previous history of breast cancer in and of itself is a risk factor. Also, the drugs that are used to treat acid reflux, some antidepressants, such as serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and some seizure medications. Vitamin D deficiency is a risk factor for osteoporosis. And if you broke a bone in your adult years, that increases your risk for developing osteoporosis later in life. And of course, there are some lifestyle factors. And this is weird, but depression increases the risk for osteoporosis. And who knows why? It may be the medications, but it also may be lifestyle, like more smoking, more drinking. A sedentary lifestyle in and of itself is a risk factor. Anytime you have elevated markers of inflammation, that increases your risk for osteoporosis as well. And here's some bad news. Consumption of large amounts of caffeine has been associated with an increased risk of fracture. But the good news is a couple of cups a day is just fine. And there's some evidence that carbonated beverages, as we say in the South, Coke, can lower bone mineral density in teenagers. But we don't really know if that's because it has a direct effect on the bone or just that they're going to Sonic all the time and not eating nutritious foods. Because nutrition is super important in developing strong bones. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, I want to switch gears and step into the office and talk about who should get a bone mineral density. Because here's the deal. There are no warning signs that you are developing osteopenia or osteoporosis. It doesn't cause pain until you start having microfractures. If you have little tiny fractures in your spine, then it can cause back pain. But it doesn't cause pain anywhere else, especially not in the joints. Although they're a critical part of the skeleton, pain in the joints is more likely related to arthritis, not osteoporosis. And of course, you can have both at the same time. So in order to determine if you're developing osteopenia or osteoporosis, you need a bone mineral density. But let's step into the office and talk about who should get a bone mineral density. Screening for osteoporosis is not routinely recommended for premenopausal women. Because you see, ladies, when we go through menopause, that's when we have an accelerated loss of bone with the loss of estrogen. And I'll be talking about that on my menopause series. And if you're not signed up for that, you might want to go to my website and sign up, or I'll put a link in the show notes. But as a general rule, premenopausal women don't need a bone density test. Who should be screened? Well, we could just pick on older people. All women 65 and older with any risk factors should have a bone mineral density test, but not men. Although some people say start screening men at 70 unless there's some evidence that they may have thin bones. Of course, you'd need x-ray vision to know that, but if you have an x-ray and the radiologist mentions it, then you would want to get screened. So basically, whether or not you should have a DEXA scan to screen for osteoporosis depends on your risk factors. So if you're a man younger than 70 or a woman younger than 65, here are some things that you might want to put on your radar. If you've ever broken a bone without much trauma, that's definitely a risk factor. Or if you're losing height, if you lose more than 1.5 inches, even if you're young, you should get screened. And if I lose 1.5 inches, I'm going to be super short. And if you've had to take steroids like prednisone for a long time, that's a risk factor. Men who have to take anti-hormones for prostate cancer have an increased risk of osteoporosis and should be screened. I mentioned frailty before. That's definitely a risk factor, and people should get screened. And we think of little old ladies and little old men as being frail, but some people age before their time. Hyperparathyroidism is another reason to get screened, or any type of malabsorption, because these are all known causes of osteoporosis. But routine screening of premenopausal women or even perimenopausal women is not recommended. Now, some people would advocate for it because what they want to do is show you, oh, your bones are getting thin. You need to take better care of yourself. And that's actually been proven. They did a study that showed that women who had a low bone mineral density test were able to make some positive lifestyle changes. So I guess it's worth it from that standpoint. Now, let's say that either you're over the age of 65 or you're younger than that and have risk factors, and now you've had a bone mineral density test and it does show a problem, either osteoporosis or osteopenia. What is a woman to do? Before we get on to medications, let's talk about lifestyle changes because, this is a lifestyle medicine podcast. Here's the deal. Even if you are taking medications, you should be making lifestyle changes to preserve your bone mass. So what is that? That is an adequate amount of calcium and vitamin D, but you probably already knew that. So should you take a supplement, or are there certain foods that contain calcium and vitamin D? Maybe, and yes. I'll give you some of those in a sec. But I also want you to remember that further bone loss can be prevented by regular weight-bearing exercise and physical activity. Also, if you smoke, it's super important to quit, and I know it's hard, but this is just one more thing that smoking does to your body. And avoiding undernutrition, but also wide fluctuations in body weight. Those people who tend to yo-yo back and forth, that's not healthy either. And be sure and moderate your alcohol consumption. So in general, there's a couple of different goals to lifestyle modification. Number one, we want to build strong bones, and that happens mostly earlier in life, but there are some small increases even in your 40s, even if you've had a low bone mineral density. Now, when you get older, these lifestyle modifications are really just to preserve what you have. Yes, bones are always turning over, and you want to make sure that they're adequately repairing what you've got. You're not going to build stronger bones, but you don't want to lose what you have. So it's still every bit as important. Now, let's talk specifically about calcium first. Calcium is a mineral, and we cannot live without it. And in addition to building strong bones and keeping them healthy, it's also important in a lot of other regulatory systems in our body that enable our blood to clot, our muscles to contract, and even heartbeat. But 99% of calcium is in our bones and teeth. And we lose it. We lose it through our skin, nails, hair, sweat, and even when we go to the bathroom. And bodies can't produce calcium on their own. That's why we have to have an adequate intake, because otherwise your body will rob it from your bones. You need a minimum of 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. Unless you're like me and over the age of 51, then you need 1,200 milligrams a day, and that goes for men and women. It's best to get that from your diet, but if you don't, then certainly taking a supplement is reasonable. In order to make sure that you're getting an adequate intake, it helps to read food labels. And if you missed that episode on my podcast, you need to go back and listen to it, because it gives you a lot of great information about how to check nutrition facts from a food label. And if you're getting 30% of the daily volume of calcium, then you're getting 300 milligrams of calcium. 20% is 200, 15% is 150. So that's important to remember. If you passed your freshman level of mini medical school, you know that vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and so are A, E, and K. But vitamin D is important in protecting your bones because it regulates calcium absorption, but it also helps support muscles. And remember, two things hold your skeleton up: your muscles and your bones. Both ought to be strong, but if your bones aren't strong, it's especially important to have strong muscles. And children need vitamin D especially because they're building bones. Adults need it more to maintain what they have. And we get vitamin D from 3 places. Number 1 is sunlight. And ironically, dark-skinned people tend to have more vitamin D deficiency than lighter-skinned people. Why is that? Well, it turns out that melanin tends to reflect the sunlight. But it is important to spend time outside and soak up that sunshine, because here's the deal: your body makes its own vitamin D. We are indeed wonderfully made. The second place you can find vitamin D is in food. Remember, food is medicine, and both calcium and vitamin D are important for your bones, and wouldn't you know it, they're often found in the same foods. What a beautiful design. And lastly is supplements. It's important to choose a supplement that is reputable. Your pharmacist can help you with this. And how much do you need? Well, 600 international units a day of vitamin D3. Of course, that's if you're young. If you're older, you need between 800 and 1,000 international units a day. And to be honest, you can take too much vitamin D. It can cause nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, confusion, pain, loss of appetite. excessive urination and thirst, kidney stones, and dehydration. So it's important to talk to your doctor and your pharmacist to make sure you're getting the right amount. But let's go back and talk about food as medicine. When it comes to calcium and vitamin D, think green. Think kale, okra, bok choy, and broccoli. Collard greens and turnip greens are great too. You can find some color though: butternut squash, rhubarb, oranges, and seeds like chia seeds, tofu, almonds, including almond milk, and beans like white beans, black beans, not jelly beans, but garbanzo beans, which are otherwise known as chickpeas, and edamame. Soy milk contains calcium and vitamin D, and canned tomatoes contain actually quite a bit. So does fortified cereal. Of course, we all know that dairy products are high in calcium and vitamin D, but that doesn't mean they're good for you. No matter how much that white mustache insists that milk does a body good, they contain high fat content. Things like yogurt, milk, and cheese, especially hard cheese, but even cottage cheese, and ice cream. Yes, it's delicious, and yes, it has calcium and vitamin D, but that doesn't mean it's good for you. Try nice cream instead. You can find that in the How Not to Die cookbook. There's a link in the show notes. I think we all know that in addition to adequate vitamin D and calcium intake, it's important to get weight-bearing exercise. Things like jumping and doing aerobics, anything that's high impact strengthens the bones, but so do resistance exercises. And those can be a lot easier on your joints or your back if you have problems. And listen, it's most important in premenopausal women because you don't really build bone after about age 50. However, as you age, you don't want your muscles to get weaker. You need to maintain your strength so you don't fall. Okay, now you've peeked into your portal and you're totally freaked out because according to your bone mineral density, you have osteoporosis. Hold up there, cowboy. Let's take a deeper dive. The fracture risk assessment tool, or FRAX model, can give you a prediction of your 10-year risk of breaking a hip, spine, or arm, either with or without results from a bone mineral density. Now, the tool is only designed to be used for people between the ages of 40 and 90, so if you're a pup, forget it. I'd also like to note that if you're comparing results of a bone mineral density DEXA scan, it's important that they're done on the same machine. There can be a little bit of difference. And so if you have a bone density in one place and then next time you have it, you go to a different place, there may be some variation. And here's something that's important to understand about medicine. Societies that make guidelines for medical care in this country are based on cost effectiveness. And here's what insurance companies look at. Is it going to cost us more to pay for a drug to treat your osteoporosis or to care for you after you break a hip? That's how recommendations are made. I just thought that was important for you to understand. So should you take medicine? Well, the National Osteoporosis Foundation does recommend that you take medication if you have osteoporosis based on your bone mineral density and you're postmenopausal. They also recommend it for people who have osteopenia and have a high risk for fracture. That's why it's important to take the whole picture into consideration. So if you're going to take medicine, which one is best? The first line therapy is what we call oral bisphosphonates. They work pretty well. They're not terribly expensive, and we have some safety data that goes back many years. A couple of big things that people worry about with these medications are necrosis of the jaw, which has happened mostly with some pretty extensive dental work. So if you're having some dental work done, it's critical that you let your dentist know. The other thing is fracture of the femur, and it's not just a normal fracture, it's what's called an atypical fracture. And remember, the femur is the thigh bone. And the thought is that maybe if you make the bone too dense, it's actually more likely to break. Well, it does happen, but it's actually very rare, and it's associated with long-term therapy. And it only occurs in about 1 in 1,000 people, which is much less than the benefit you get from strengthening the hip bone and preventing hip fractures. So although it's a serious complication, the benefit of preventing osteoporotic fractures actually outweighs the risk of this atypical fracture. But it got a lot of press in the media when they first started recognizing it. I'm going to try to do a quick review of the medications used to treat osteoporosis. An extensive look at that is beyond the scope of this podcast. But first, let's talk about what doesn't work. One drug is calcitonin. To be honest, it just doesn't work very well, and also there's an increased risk of cancer. Also, androgens like testosterone are not recommended. Then there's some supplements that don't work, like vitamin K, folate, and vitamin B12, although they're good for you. They don't really prevent osteoporosis, and isoflavones, as well as fluoride. And here's a funny story. They tried using vibration platforms where they vibrated your whole body to put some more pressure on your bones and make them stronger. And yeah, unfortunately, that doesn't work. Passive vibration doesn't help. You got to get out there and pound the pavement for yourself. The most commonly used drug is Fosamax or alendronate. The problem with it is that you have to take it first thing in the morning on an empty stomach, and you can't even have your coffee for 30 minutes afterwards. But the good news is you only have to do that once a week. It's usually well tolerated, but it can really mess up your esophagus. So if you already have problems with that, it's not a good choice. And for some people, it is a hard regimen to follow. The other options are an IV infusion, such as Reclast, or the shot, which is a subcutaneous injection, such as Prolia. And that is preferred for anyone who's had surgery for weight loss because they don't absorb it as well. Most people can take the pill. So if you have osteoporosis and you're a woman over the age of 65 or a man over the age of 70, you probably do need medication. And for people younger than that, well, it depends on your risk factors. So what's the bottom line? Well, that depends on your age. If you're under the age of 40 and maybe even 50, prevention is key. You should build strong bones when you're young because once you get older, around 50, the goal shifts to maintaining what you already have. And in order to do that, you need an adequate intake of calcium and vitamin D. Food is your very best medicine for that. But if you can't get enough in your diet, take a supplement. And weight-bearing exercise not only helps maintain your bone strength, but it also strengthens your muscles. And if your muscles are strong, you're less likely to fall. And without falling, you are a whole lot less likely to break. So keep exercising so that you can maintain strong muscles and healthy bones, because healthy looks great on you. The information contained in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not considered to be a substitute for medical advice. You should continue to follow up with your physician or healthcare provider and take medication as prescribed. Though the information in this podcast is evidence-based, new research may develop and recommendations may change.